All right, welcome. Today we are diving into a really foundational historical claim, this idea of an unbroken chain of prophets stretching all the way from the biblical patriarchs to 7th century Arabia. We're going to play detective and follow the paper trail to see what the documents actually have to say. And this brings us right to the heart of it all, the central question we're tackling. Was this chain so unbroken that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were in fact the very first Muslims, those who submitted to God? Well, let's see where that paper trail takes us. Now, the basis for this idea of a single, continuous message comes from verses just like this one in the Qur'an. The concept here is that there's no real difference between the prophets, that they all deliver the exact same core message across time. It's all one story.
So our job here is to put on our historian hats. We're on the hunt for evidence. Is there any kind of paper trail for this specific story? The one that connects Abraham and Ishmael to Mecca, and any text that was written before the 7th century. That's the key.
Okay, so first things first. Let's start our investigation with the oldest, most detailed source we have on these figures, the Hebrew Bible. What's the story it tells?
Well, when you look at the Hebrew Bible, the account is laser-focused and incredibly consistent. The deity Yahweh is always called the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The text couldn't be clearer that the covenant, that big central promise, is passed down through Isaac, not Ishmael. And geographically, the whole story is set in Canaan. There's just no mention of Arabia at all.
And here we hit a really pivotal moment where the narratives just completely diverge. In the Hebrew Bible, it explicitly by name says Isaac is the son to be sacrificed. But in the Qur'an, written many centuries later, the story is understood to be about Ishmael. I mean, this isn't a small detail. It's a fundamental contradiction about one of the most important events in Abraham's life.
So the biblical record is pretty straightforward. But you might be thinking, okay, but that's just one version of the story, right? Fair enough. Let's widen our search. What do other ancient texts, written in that long period between the patriarchs and the 7th century, have to say?
And this is where it gets fascinating. For over 700 years before Islam even appears, the historical record is incredibly consistent. Whether you're looking at the Dead Sea Scrolls, the writings of the Jewish historian Josephus, or early Christian theologians, the story is always the same. Isaac is the chosen heir. They all agree that Ishmael is the father of the Arabs, but not one of them mentions him being the sacrificial son or building a holy site in Mecca.
So what's the big takeaway here? After sifting through centuries of Jewish and Christian literature that talks all about these very figures, the number of documents that support the specific story of Abraham and Ishmael in Mecca is, well, it's a big fat zero. The paper trail just goes completely cold.
Okay, but what about Arabia itself? I mean, surely if Abraham and Ishmael were such central figures there, building the most important shrine in Mecca, the local people would have some record of it, right? Some story, some poem. Let's go right to the source and see what pre-Islamic Arabia tells us.
And the evidence from the ground is really telling. Yes, the name for a high god, Allah, absolutely existed in pre-Islamic Arabia. We see it carved in rocks and mentioned in poetry. But, and this is the key point, we see absolutely no connection made between this deity and Abraham, or Isaac, or Ishmael, or the Kaaba. The specific stories we're looking for are just not there.
Which leads us back to this. When we scan all the available local sources from before the 7th century, the pagan inscriptions, the poems, for any mention of Abraham or Ishmael in Mecca, or building the Kaaba, how many do we find? You guessed it, 0. The paper trail for this story in the very place it supposedly happened is completely non-existent.
So, just to recap, we have this incredibly consistent record across hundreds of years, multiple cultures, different religions. And then, all of a sudden, in the 7th century, bam, the story radically changes. A completely new narrative explodes onto the historical scene.
For the very first time in any document in history, the Quran introduces these revolutionary claims. Suddenly, Ishmael is the child of the sacrifice. Abraham and Ishmael are the builders of the Kaaba in Mecca. And all the prophets who came before are now redefined retroactively as Muslims who followed this specific tradition.
And this, right here, is the central argument of the source material we're looking at. This new, detailed narrative, which becomes the bedrock of a New World religion, just appears in the 7th century seemingly out of nowhere, with absolutely no prior documentary evidence to back it up. No earlier version, no legend, no whisper of it in any older text.
So we followed the paper trail through the Bible, through Jewish and Christian history, and through pre-Islamic Arabian sources. After looking at all the evidence we have,
What's the final verdict?
This scorecard really lays it all out, doesn't it? It's so clear. Every single source before the 7th century that talks about the covenant points straight to Isaac, and none of them, not even the local Arabian ones, ever place Abraham or Ishmael in Mecca. That story only shows up with the Qur'an, which, at the same time, shifts the whole focus away from Isaac.
This really shows the two completely different models we're looking at. You've got the Judeo-Christian trail, which is like a documented chain of texts, each building on the last, stretching over centuries. Then you have the Islamic trail, which, according to the sources, begins in the 7th century and reinterprets the past by declaring it so, but without that preceding chain of documents for its unique claims.
And that brings us to this key concept: historical continuity. See, it's not just about saying you're connected to the past. It's about having a verifiable, unbroken paper trail, actual texts, inscriptions, and records that you can follow, showing how a specific story was passed down through time.
So, based on that definition, the documentary record leads to a pretty stark conclusion. The patriarchs lived and died centuries before the specific ideas and practices of Islam were ever formed. They worshiped Yahweh. The sources we're examining argue that this entire narrative, the one centered on Ishmael and a Kaaba built by Abraham in Mecca, appears de novo, which is just a fancy way of saying out of the blue, in the 7th century.
And that leaves us with a final, pretty powerful question to think about. If a story that is absolutely central to a faith appears so suddenly in the historical record, with no documented precedent to be found anywhere, what does that imply about where that story came from? It's the question the documents themselves force us to ask. Thanks for digging into this with us.